Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Department of Family Medicine, Government Medical College, Kozhikode, I welcome you all to the sixth topic of series of webinars we are hosting. And the topic for today is fever, clinical evaluation. Where to begin? Do we need to investigate all? And all fevers are not COVID. And to evaluate fever, we need a great deal of clinical skill. And to impart that clinical skill, we have a renowned clinician, Dr. P.K. Shashidharan, former HOD, Department of General Medicine, Government Medical College, Kozhikode. And those who have any queries, please put in the chat box or raise your hands. Over to you, sir.
Shall I? Thank you. I thought we will discuss fever clinical approach because of the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19. It is extremely important. Now we hear that the additional problem of Zika virus coming in on top of the already existing issues. So I thought I will discuss this time on clinical approach to fever so that we use our resources more judiciously. Shall I share my screen?
Yes, sir.
Hope you can see now.
Yeah, sir, clear.
Can you see now?
Yes, sir.
So this is the title of the talk, as mentioned already. So to begin with, let me tell one thing that any fever is identified or is possible to identify only by proper clinical evaluation, and that needs clinical skill. And that also includes familiarity with patterns of each illness, their symptoms and signs, and awareness of what is common and what is rare in that particular individual, of that particular age and gender, in that region, in that season. So many factors are there. What is common, what is rare is an important issue to be taken into consideration when you decide on the cause of a fever. How to develop all this is first by listening to teachers, then by reading, and by working with patients, clinical experience. And if you do not have all the three, it is unlikely to develop an ability to diagnose any fever. And then if you have a clinical diagnosis, then we can use simple, easily accessible laboratory tests and their proper interpretation, which again one has to learn from experienced teachers. But anyway, a diagnosis of fevers are never by depending on costly or the so-called specific laboratory tests in every patient. That's absurdity. History taking is the most important point in arriving at the cause of fever. It has to be meticulous. It is more than a detective's job while eliciting history, especially in a febrile patient. Very often, I have found that a difficult diagnosis, the epidemiological setting has given the clue to the diagnosis. And if there are 2 or 3 or more symptoms, the chronology of symptoms, which came first, which came next, is a very important issue to get a clue to the diagnosis. And for each symptom, we need to find out the relation to events in the patient's life preceding the onset of the symptoms. That is, the food, the travel, drugs, surgical or dental procedures, occupational exposure to animals, infectious agents, possible antigens, including vaccination. Contact with febrile or infected individuals at home, workplace, or school is another issue. I will divide my talk into 2 halves. First, about short fevers, because these are the commonest ones, including COVID-19, patients coming with fever less than 5 days, and those coming with fever more than a week. Most common are the short fevers, that is fever less than 5 days. And the commonest are respiratory transmitted viral infections, including the present COVID-19. They're all easy to diagnose if there are associated symptoms like runny nose, sore throat, sneezing, coughing, and headache. And all these people, irrespective of the cause of the virus that is causing the disease, they recover usually in less than 5 to 7 days. But some minor symptoms may last up to 2 weeks, some fatigue and all. Again, it is decided by individual, the host characteristics. Only those people with underlying other health problems may develop pneumonia, not all of them. But unfortunately, in COVID-19, things have gone out of our hands, and we attribute even the pneumonia to COVID-19. That is, again, a wrong approach. The short fevers are commonly known as common colds or influenza or flu. There are some 200 viruses implicated in causing these illnesses. That includes rhinovirus, coronavirus. Do not think it is a new discovery. Adenoviruses, enteroviruses, these are the most common. They all spread through air during close contact with infected people or through contact with objects in the environment and by transfer to nose, thereby fomite transmission. Influenza is slightly different. The symptoms are similar to the common cold, and the fever is a little more severe, but runny nose is less as compared to other viral infections. Otherwise, they also have a similar course. There is no vaccine for the common colds, including till recently by the COVID-19 is only exception now. So that again brings us to the question, was it essential to have a vaccine for COVID-19? Because till now we have approached all of these common colds without a vaccine. Even for influenza, which is one of the severest among those infections, we used to give vaccine only for the, some predisposed individuals. The primary methods of prevention are hand washing, not touching the eyes, nose, or mouth with unwashed hands, staying away from sick people, or use of masks. And there is no specific medicine. Even now, that is true. And symptoms can be easily treated. Most frequent infectious disease anywhere in the world is common cold and influenza. An average adult gets 2 to 3 colds a year. Average child may get 6 to 8. And infections may occur commonly during winter. In our situation, it may be more during rainy season. And they have existed throughout human history. I am tempted to think right from beginning of COVID-19 that it can easily be considered as just one of these common called like illnesses. That's what common sense makes me think of, in spite of having all the cases reported as COVID-19. This my outlook. I hope at least now people have started looking at that way. Singapore has already declared it as just like a common cold. So in short few ways, the guideline is no need to consult unless there are alarm signals. You don't have to consult anybody unless there are alarm signals. But short few ways need not be common cold. So we need to look for alarm signals, even if the patient comes with fever less than 5 days. And that these are called alarm signals, as I'm going to describe. One should be on the lookout for absence of the respiratory symptoms and the presence of alarm signals. If the respiratory symptoms are absent and if alarm signals are present, they need evaluation. That is severe myalgia, no respiratory symptoms, suspect leptospirosis or dengue fever. If the patient has severe congestion of eyes without respiratory symptoms, again think of dengue and leptospirosis. But in these two, also the fever subsides in 5 days, in less than 5 days in both. But you may get congestion of eyes in infection mononucleosis, but the fever does not subside in 5 days. It continues, but it's a rare thing. And it has several other findings which makes it unique and it is easy to diagnose it. But one has to be cautious about the congestion of eyes due to other reasons, that atopic tendency, patients with polycythemia, which again is a common disorder these days because of the secondary polycythemia of weight gain, and alcoholics can also have congestion of eyes. If the patient has high fever, shaking, chills, and rigor, that needs evaluation. That is also an alarm signal for evaluation. Other alarm signals are like these: fever with vomiting, diarrhea, or both. Fever with breathlessness. That's where the patient has gone on to develop pneumonia or ARDS. And it is not diagnosed with pulse oximeters. It is diagnosed with the symptoms only. It is not possible to equip the patient with pulse oximeter to diagnose that. Fever with altered sensorium or seizures. Fever with dehydration, as evidenced by decreased urine output, giddiness, or development of edema also. One has to, fever with edema also, they have to consult because that is complicating illnesses are there. Or when the fever is persisting beyond 4 or 5 days, especially when it is more than 5 days, they have to be evaluated. Or when the fever is an unusual one, that is soon after travel outside without other members in the household getting affected. These are the alarm signals for evaluation. Otherwise, short fevers with respiratory symptoms without these alarm signals need not be investigated. Do not investigate or refer short fevers without these alarm signals. And if we start doing that, it will only complicate the picture and end up in chaos. That's exactly what has happened in COVID-19. Suppose you take the case of dengue fever, and people are doing dengue serology or NS1 antigen even for thrombocytopenia nowadays. The common sense has gone beyond recognition now. COVID-19 RT-PCR is exactly like that. I see people getting leptoserology done for thrombocytopenia. Investigations are done injudiciously, and we should know always that asymptomatic COVID positives, just like an incidentaloma detected on ultrasound scan, it has nothing to do with the patient's problem, and we are doing it in terms of the because of the heightened fear of transmitting infection to high-risk people. But that can be covered simply by universal precautions, mask and hand washing. That's more than enough. Or you don't have to lock down people to control COVID-19 as is being practiced now. And what do these alarm signals indicate? It could be another fever. That means it is not a respiratory virus, common viral infection, or the patient with a respiratory viral disease has other underlying illnesses. So that is what we are looking for. It's not that the virus has produced a serious disease when you get alarm signals. That's another mistake. A patient with COVID-19 positive on the RT-PCR or antigen test having serious symptoms does not mean that the virus is responsible for it. If the virus is responsible, all people infected with the virus would have got it, like people who get chickenpox and other diseases. So now coming to fewer more than 5 days duration, the objective of evaluation is looking for the alarm signals. Yeah, that means you are looking for another cause or underlying serious comorbidities. These are the causes for fewer more than 5 days duration. The common causes only should be considered first. In our scenario, it will be enteric fever and the similar condition, scrub typhus. Both have similar clinical features. An upper urinary tract infection is an important differential diagnosis, but you need to look for other symptoms. Especially falciparum malaria is an important etiology for short fevers, high fevers. Acute infective endocarditis should not be forgotten, or liver abscess or pus somewhere. These are the common problems for fever more than 5 days, especially when there are no respiratory symptoms. But if the fever continues beyond 1 week or 2 weeks, or it is lasting 3 or 4 weeks, the same causes which I mentioned before are the priority in the possibility. But as the duration goes on increasing, these possibilities come up, like miliary tuberculosis, brucellosis, collagen vascular disease, lymphoma. More often it is Hodgkin's disease, leukemias, and psychogenic fever should not be forgotten. Psychogenic fever is the feeling that uh, the patient is afraid of having fever, but actually there is no fever. What did the patient mean by fever is an important issue that we need to consider. When a patient comes with fever, do not presume that all of them have fever. First and foremost, in the evaluation of a febrile patient, is to find out what did the patient mean by fever. Some of them may say that I have internal fever. Finally, we will have to convince them, saying that that is just normal for them. Many of them come because of the fear that they have fever. This is because when they palpate the body of their own body or somebody else's body towards evening, with a exposed hand or a cold hand, they may get the feeling that it is fever. They haven't done medicine, they have no experience. They consult the doctor because of that fear that there is fever. So we need to find out, is it a psychogenic fever, or a fear of having fever, or some rare patients might be even fooling us, factitious fever. So before proceeding with evaluation, the most important is to find out whether the patient has fever or not. And now, how to interpret other symptoms occurring along with fever. Again, our objective is to look for the serious infections or the serious comorbidities occurring along with febrile illnesses. Chills and rigors in fevers are seen specifically in some conditions. Chills and rigor should be shaking chills and rigor. This is seen in malaria, acute pyelonephritis, cholangitis, pus somewhere, biliary tuberculosis, Hodgkin's disease. But remember that all these can also present without chills and rigor. Cough in a febrile patient, we need to think of several conditions. Dry cough can occur in endemic fever. Coexisting atopic tendency is an important cause. Incidentally, existing asthma or ectopic tendency may be the reason. Or if it is an ongoing problem without a diagnosis, think of extrinsic compression by lymph node, as you get in some patients with tuberculosis or lymphoma. Some patients only with tuberculosis come with intractable cough, especially if they have an endobronchial involvement. Productive cough and fever, things are easily diagnosed. It may be in a bronchitis or acute or chronic bronchitis, pneumonias or pulmonary tuberculosis or lung abscess or bronchiectasis, secondary infection. Some patients with fever may come to us with a coexisting pleuritic chest pain. Any of the pneumonias you need to consider because they may start developing synpneumonic pleural involvement and effusion. Miliary tuberculosis pleuris is another problem. If it is on the right side, one should entertain hepatopulmonary amoebiasis, but do not forget pulmonary embolism with pulmonary infarction. This is an important complicating problem in any patient with febrile illness. Very often it is a non-specific musculoskeletal pain. Urinary symptoms and fever, the objective is to look for urinary tract infection. Dysuria alone does not mean urinary tract infection. Any fever with the concentrated urine can give rise to the symptom. But dysuria with increased frequency, altered stream, suprapubic pain, and loin pain is definitely a pyelonephritis. Some patients may give history of hematuria or pyuria, which is often detected microscopically, but some of them can have it macroscopically as well. If you have all these symptoms, undoubtedly we are dealing with a urinary tract infection. Diarrhea in a febrile patient, most often, especially with a short fever, it's a bacillary dysentery. If it is after a week, it could be enteric fever, scrub typhus. Very often, it is antibiotic induced. The temporal correlation between febrile illness, antibiotic intake is the pointer to the diagnosis of antibiotic-induced diarrhea. Falciparum malaria can fool us. The algid malaria can produce diarrhea. It's very often mistaken for enteric fever sometimes. But do not forget the Addisonian crisis. There are people walking around with subclinical hypoadrenalism. When they get an febrile illness, it may be unmasked and can produce an Addisonian crisis. They can come with vomiting or diarrhea or both. And then coming to patient with fever and vomiting. First and foremost is acute gastritis due to several reasons. That's the most important. But it can also occur with acute pyelonephritis or a coexisting hepatocellular damage, which may be due to a drug or an underlying liver disease or the febrile illness. Like, for example, malaria can have significant hepatocellular damage, or it can be rare occurrence of pancreatitis. Very often, it could be a part of an infective diarrhea because many patients with bacillary dysentery start with fever, headache, and vomiting. The diarrhea comes on the next day. Sometimes you need to consider CNS infection with the raised intracranial tension, especially if they have headache as well. But occasionally, the vomiting in a febrile patient may be due to uremia precipitated by the infection because fever is a catabolic state. If they have had compromised renal function, with the onset of fever and catabolism, they can progress to develop uremia, and that can produce vomiting. Again, vomiting may be the indication of an underlying precipitation of Addisonic crisis in a febrile patient. Because of the, it's very common to get hypotension these days because of prolonged steroid use or autoimmune mechanisms or due to underlying tuberculosis. So one should be on the lookout for hypotension when you get unexplained vomiting or diarrhea or both. How do we interpret headache in a febrile patient? Headache is a very common symptom in enteric fever. In fact, some patients with enteric fever, the first symptom is headache. I had seen patients getting investigated with the CT scan even. The fever comes next day. So one should be on the lookout for that. It is very often non-specific. In any febrile illness, people get headache, especially if they're prone for vascular headaches. If they have blocked nostrils or if they're prone for migraine, any febrile illness can precipitate migraine. So one should be on the lookout for these possible causes. And lastly, it could be due to an infected lesion in head and neck region, which can trigger again migraine. But do not forget serious problems. If somebody comes with fever, headache, and vomiting, or headache alone, one should never forget to look for CNS infections and the complicating problem of cerebral vein thrombosis. When to consider CNS infection or cerebral vein thrombosis as a cause of headache in a febrile patient? If the patient has seizures, one should think of it. If the patient has neck stiffness, you have to think of it. If there are lateralizing or localizing signs like monoparesis or hemiplegia or features of raised intracerebral tension or altered high mental functions, one should entertain these possibilities. If the patient has fever and altered sensorium, think of these possibilities. Very often, it could be a serious problem, but easily treatable if you suspect it. Cerebral vein thrombosis can be coexisting with any of the infections, including enteric fever or other problems. Or it may be enteric fever with encephalopathy or cerebral malaria or meningoencephalitis may be the reason, or tuberculous meningitis. But it can also be precipitation of hepatic encephalopathy because there are many people walking around with the chronic liver disease. When they get a febrile illness, it can trigger or precipitation of hepatic encephalopathy. Or the infection itself could have damaged the liver significantly, which I had seen in falciparum malaria. Falciparum malaria can sometimes produce severe hepatocellular damage, which has been even mistaken for acute fulminant hepatitis. And they may come in coma because of the hepatic encephalopathy. Or it may be a brain abscess with fever and meningoencephalitis in addition to that. Think of the other possibilities when a patient with fever has altered sensorium. It could be metabolic problems coexisting. These are also very common because there are patients on diabetes with oral hypoglycemic agents which are more than what is needed for them. They may go into hypoglycemia or they may have hypoadelism. They can go into hyponatremia or hypoglycemia, or uremia can precipitate altered sensorium, as I mentioned before. Or if the patient by chance has a idiopathic seizure disorder, after the fever, the patient would have developed a seizure disorder and maybe brought in a post-ictal state, and that may be the reason for the altered sensorium. And still rarely, a febrile patient with altered sensorium may be having an underlying cerebrovascular accident like transient ischemic attack, which is especially common with the vertebrobasilar territory involvement. If the febrile patient has seizures, first and foremost possibility one we need to consider nowadays is cerebral vein thrombosis as a coexisting problem, or the fever would have precipitated an idiopathic seizure, or there are coexisting metabolic problems like the altered high mental function, like the hyponatremia, hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, and hypomagnesemia. These are all very common problems which can trigger seizures. Still rarely, it could be an encephalitis. But very often, I had seen that patients who are referred as encephalitis end up having a wrong diagnosis of CVT. It is cerebral vein thrombosis, mistakenly diagnosed as encephalitis. Meningitis can also produce seizures due to the complicating cerebral vein thrombosis or due to other reasons. If a patient with fever has arthritis or arthralgia, how do we go about doing it? If the patient has a single joint involvement with a swollen joint redness, patient finds it very difficult to move the joint because of severe pain. It's maybe septic arthritis. But it could also be beginning of a polyarthritis like rheumatic fever, where the patient can have high-grade fever. When they come with polyarthritis and fever, established polyarthritis or polyarthralgia and fever, think of some viral fevers if it's a short duration, but it's a long fever, think of reactive arthritis secondary to urinary tract infection or GI infections. Do not forget rheumatic fever there. And in prolonged fever with polyarthritis, start considering septicemia, which could be meningococcal or gonococcal or even salmonella. In people who are predisposed to get reactive arthritis, I had seen patients with endemic fever coming with arthritis. Or it could be due to a miliary tuberculosis. The arthritis may be reactive arthritis due to tuberculosis. Or SLE can present with the polyarthritis and fever. This is a very not an uncommon presentation. Subacute endocarditis is not to present like that. But do not forget autoimmune disorders like serum sickness or vasculitic disorders. They can present with polyarthritis and prolonged fever. And rarely, it could be the manifestation of a hematological malignancy. I had one patient with acute myeloid leukemia referred as rheumatic fever because the ESO titer was 2000. The patient had sore throat, ESR was very high, but the counts made me suspicious. Arthralgia and leukemias can be due to different reasons. So you may get hematological malignancies also presenting sometimes with fever and polyarthritis. Coming to past history in prolonged fevers, one should meticulously ask for the drug therapy and find out which drug they are on and what was a response to it, or is there a lack of response to that particular drug. That gives a clue to the diagnosis. Sometimes the patient may be on having a fever of 1 week or so and is getting a quinolone and the patient feels slightly better. You may think that the patient is not responding. Actually, the patient has started responding. You need to continue that. So meticulously, carefully study the response to the treatment. In endemic fever, the fever does not respond immediately. They take at least 5 to 7 days sometimes. So if there is some response, and if your clinical diagnosis is endemic fever, should not change it. That is why you need to find out the drug therapy in detail. Find out whether the patient received steroid for the fever or during fever or prior to the onset of fever. Suppose the patient was on long-term steroid therapy, it could precipitate an Addisonic crisis if you do not continue it. And the steroid would have been used as a measure of treatment for some reason or other, and it can suppress fever temporarily. The patient's response would have been due to that. This can happen sometimes. And also get the history of hospitalization, the procedures done before coming to us, including blood transfusion, and also get details of travel outside, not necessarily travel outside the state. Any travel, any history of contact with unusual situations or eating from outside, contact with animals, all these can give important clues to diagnosis sometimes. If a patient gets fever after surgery or a hospitalization, think of an abscess or a hematoma, which could be on an unresolved hematoma or an abscess underlying, maybe the reason. Or infected foreign bodies may be left behind. Or it could be transfusion related. Even transfusion malaria can occur. The transfusion malaria does not have the usual incubation period. They may start developing fever the next day. Or it may be due to the drug itself, drug fever, or catheter related urinary tract infection or thrombophlebitis. All these should be considered if the patient comes with fever after surgery or hospitalization. And if by chance the fever develops after post-splenectomy or post-chemotherapy, then you need to think of other unusual serious ill problems even. Coming to past history in undiagnosed fevers, it's important to inquire about unusual hobbies and travel or meticulous travel details and high risk behaviors, getting high risk sexual behaviors or drug addictions, intake of poorly cooked meat or raw fish or unpasteurized milk. In fact, one patient developed brucellosis after consuming unpasteurized milk. Another patient developed brucellosis by handling raw meat because he was making shawarma in a Gulf country. Contact with household pets, sexual orientation practices to think of unusual infections, IV drug abuse, alcohol intake prior to the onset of fever, trauma, animal bites, tick bites, all are important. And even immunization, drug allergies, and hypersensitivities may give a clue to the cause. Inquire about details of all past illnesses because many symptoms are due to these underlying comorbidities like uncontrolled diabetes, the medicines the patient is using. Because hypoglycemia, we need to assess only by finding out which medicine at what dose and what is the relation to medicine intake and food intake. And that can suggest hypoglycemia as a cause for the altered sensorium. And the diabetic status, the controlled status, and the complication status need to be assessed. The presence of hypertension, its controlled status, and the medicines used for hypertension, all these are important to decide on the management of the patient. COPD has to be assessed. If it is there, the breathlessness may simply be due to exacerbation of it, and smoking history has to be carefully asked for. Past history of asthma atopy is important. The cough may be simply due to the coexisting asthma or atopy. You may think the patient has a respiratory infection. In fact, the patient may be having urinary infection sometimes. And also about past history of angina, rheumatic heart disease, because the cardiac symptoms or the respiratory symptoms or cardiac symptoms may be due to exacerbation of these conditions. Inquire about habits, diet, and lifestyle. These are extremely important because these are the things finally which decide the course of any infection. We need to find out the history of weight gain. In COVID-19 especially, if you have a patient with COVID-19 and weight gain, that person is going to fare badly as compared to a lean person who is eating a balanced diet. So we need to assess all the probability of developing non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, because if they have underlying non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, they also have a hyperinflammatory state, uncontrolled diabetes, polycythemia, all could be there. Hypertension could be there. In addition to that, they have a hypercoagulable state also, and these people are more likely to get thrombotic complications. Smoking details meticulously you need to ask, not that he used to smoke sometime in the past, because that can predispose to respiratory symptoms. And the alcohol consumption details, its relation to a present episode of fever. It may be following an aspiration after alcohol intake, the patient developed respiratory symptoms and fever. And diet in very detail, extreme detail is very important, because most patients who get into problems are people with vitamin deficiencies. And even protein is missing in their diet. Vegetables and fruits are notoriously absent. Even water intake is less, and they develop dehydration and thrombotic tendency. So we need to assess the probability of vitamin D, B12, and folic acid deficiency by getting a proper dietary history. And that will assess the chance or likelihood of improving properly or deteriorating. And also history of clustering of cases, because the respiratory transmitted or fecal or transmitted diseases, we can predict by clustering of cases. That is, other members in the family or neighborhood developing similar illness is a clue to this kind of transmission. And then we can predict what it could be. Infections in neighborhood is important for that reason, especially for viral hepatitis, hepatitis A. Coming to the physical examination, it has to be meticulous, head to foot. All systems have to be looked at. All vital signs are relevant. Record vital signs daily to know the deterioration or progress. Daily physical examination for new findings till the diagnosis is certain. And how to interpret physical signs in a febrile patient. I'll take one by one. General appearance, the patient looks very sick, agitated, anxious, confused. You suspect septicemia. That patient needs hospitalization. If the patient has hypotension and increased respiratory rate, it again makes you suspect septicemia. Maybe the patient is going for ARDS. Clotted tongue with peripheries clear is a very important finding for typhoid fever. But similar finding you might get in typhus also. They also have tremulousness of the tongue. This is a very useful sign once you are suspected enteric fever. Dry brown coating in a febrile patient suggests that the patient has started developing uremia. If the patient looks emaciated like this, that means there are several aspects to the disease. This malnutrition is responsible for the infection, and unless you address partly at least the problems arising this malnutrition, you will not be able to make the patient recover from the illness. Such patients could be having chronic infections like tuberculosis or HIV or even GI malignancies. Persistent tachycardia in a febrile patient might suggest myocarditis. Arrhythmias can suggest myocarditis or underlying ischemic heart disease. The volume of the pulse may appear high, but the patient may be in hypotension in sepsis. If the patient is febrile and is having hypotension, therefore suspect septicemia myocarditis, but do not forget Addisonian crisis. This is a very common problem nowadays. And do not forget ischemic heart disease and arrhythmias causing hypotension. By chance, a febrile patient appears to be hypertensive. Think of pre-existing hypertension only as the first possibility, but incidentally, it could be a thyrotoxic crisis if there are other features like a wide pulse pressure, severe tachycardia, or very rarely it could be a tricyclic overdose also if you get a appropriate clinical setting. If you find pallor in a febrile patient, first and foremost suspect nutritional deficiency, B12 folic acid iron deficiency. Look for their features. When you find any of these suspicion, look for its features by further details in history and physical examination. So for example, when you suspect B12 deficiency or iron deficiency, look for skin changes, nail changes, like knuckle pigmentation, mucosal changes, or it may be hemolysis. If the patient has a rapid drop in hemoglobin especially, you need to suspect a hemolytic tendency in a febrile patient. This can happen in malaria, but sometimes it may be due to other reasons. Incidental blood loss may be occurring into the GI tract or elsewhere, or concealed bleeding can occur. Subacute endocarditis is known to produce anemia by suppressing the bone marrow, or it may be a collagen vascular disease with autoimmune hemolysis or MDS-like presentation. Rarely, it could be bone marrow infiltrating disorders like leukemias. If you find jaundice in a febrile patient, think of Gilbert syndrome first, because that does not require any more investigation. If the patient does not have hepatocellular damage, just mild jaundice, no symptoms of hepatocellular damage, and the bilirubin is unconjugated, just leave the patient alone if the hemoglobin also is normal. But enteric fever and falciparum malaria can have significant liver involvement. And you may get jaundice due to that. They continue to have fever and jaundice. As compared to the viral hepatitis, by the time jaundice appears, the fever subsides. But in enteric fever and falciparum malaria, even in spite of having jaundice, the fever continues. This is a situation where you need to consider these two possibilities. So enteric fever and malaria, falciparum malaria can present with high-grade fever, jaundice, and in malaria especially, you may even get significant hepatocellular damage. Cholangitis and fever, cholangitis can produce high-grade fever, chills and anger, and jaundice. Pruritus may or may not be there, but hepatocellular damage is minimal. Acute hepatitis is usually not a cause for fever and jaundice, because in acute viral hepatitis or hepatitis A or hepatitis E even, by the time jaundice appears, the fever subsides. So if they have fever, and if you're sure it is hepatitis A, the fever is due to complicating illness. We had seen complicating urinary tract infection, typhoid fever, malaria, even scrub typhus. Sometimes two common infections can coexist. So if you have definite hepatitis A, and if the fever continues, it is not due to hepatitis A. Leptospirosis also, the fever subsides within less than 5 to 6 days. And by the time the jaundice, deep jaundice and renal involvement appears, they are febrile. So if they continue to have fever and the patient is sure to have leptospirosis, think of other causes like coexisting urinary tract infection or other reasons. Jaundice and fever could also be due to autoimmune hemolysis or the collagen vascular disease, or a pre-existing undetected congenital hemolytic states like sickle cell disease or hereditary spherocytosis, where you may get splenomegaly as well. Underlying chronic liver disease may go undetected, and the jaundice can develop during the febrile illness. Or very rarely, IV hemolysis of G6PD deficiency, or still rarely, extremely rarely, it may be a septicemia of Clostridium welshi or mismatched transfusion, where you may get a history of blood transfusion prior to the onset of fever and jaundice. If you find lymphadenopathy and fever, generalized lymphadenopathy and fever, think of infectious mononucleosis and HIV seroconversion illness. But you may get the same in SLE and serum sickness like syndrome due to several reasons. Even drugs can produce that. Lymphoma can present with generalized lymphadenopathy and fever. Leukemia is another condition. Very rarely biliary tuberculosis, that too in children only. Tuberculosis does not present with the lymphadenopathy, especially generalized lymphadenopathy. So one should not entertain tuberculosis as an important cause when the generalized lymphadenopathy is there in a febrile patient. Edema in a febrile patient. First, you need to consider cardiac problems. Look for JVP because a cardiac failure may be precipitated by febrile illness because of the increased cardiac output, need for increased cardiac output, and the patient may go into cardiac failure. Look for its features by physical examination and the precipitating factors. Or very often it is an underlying chronic liver disease because of NAFLD, which is very common these days, or alcoholic liver disease even. Or it may be a pre-existing renal problem with acute worsening, where they may get puffiness as well. But these days, edema and puffiness in a febrile patient is very often due to acute interstitial nephritis because they get NSAID exposure most often as an over-the-counter medication, but some doctors still continue to use NSAID for control of fever and myalgia, which is inappropriate, and that can result in edema and puffiness. Very rarely, we had seen cases of subacute endocarditis with renal involvement presenting like a glomerular nephritis with edema and puffiness. Rashes in a febrile patient, it will be obvious because we are all familiar with the rash of measles, chickenpox, rubella, but need to consider infectious mononucleosis and HIV seroconversion as well. And drug-induced rashes, they are more often pruritic rashes. Look for lymphangitis, cellulitis, and thrombophlebitis as a cause for fever. Vasculitic lesions, if they are present, might indicate collagen vascular disease or serum sickness as a cause for fever. Look for erythema nodosum skin lesions. This is a patient, you can see the maculopapular rash, conjunctival congestion, and in the oral cavity, you may look for Koplik spots. These are measles. This erythema nodosum, it makes you think that the patient is either having tuberculosis or a streptococcal infection, or rarely SLE sometimes. If you have these kind of lesions, think of meningococcemia or vasculitic lesions, vasculitic disorders. In the oral cavity, look for petechiae, gum bleeds, gum hypertrophy, tonsillar enlargement, and caries teeth, which could be the source of infection, infected endocarditis. And never forget to look for oral candidiasis because it might suggest severe immunosuppressed state or an uncontrolled diabetes, which needs to be tackled. Always look for tachypnea in a febrile patient. They may not complain of it because of several other complaints. And once you have to look for tachypnea. Once you detect tachypnea or they complain of dyspnea, very carefully look for exacerbation of COPD or asthma. Look for its features by history and physical examination and predisposition like smoking history and atopic tendency. It could be severe pneumonia or atypical pneumonias with bilateral involvement or a bronchopneumonia, especially staphylococcal. But do not forget pulmonary thromboembolism. Any febrile patient can have pulmonary embolism as a complicating factor, and they may come with acute exacerbation of acute severe breathlessness. Or it may be that the fever has precipitated left ventricular failure in a patient with poor left ventricular function, maybe due to several ischemic heart disease or other valvular disease, and the patient develops pulmonary edema after onset of fever. The capitations may be due to this and not due to the febrile illness. Or acute respiratory distress syndrome, the non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema can occur in severe sepsis. These days, it is known to occur with the COVID infection also, the interstitial pneumonia. Dyspnea or tachypnea in a febrile patient, one should not forget Dobar pneumonia with this pneumonic effusion, or it may be a staphylococcal pneumonia with pneumothorax, or metabolic acidosis should not be forgotten, where you get a deep and rapid breathing, just is clear, because the febrile illness, irrespective of the nature of it, would have precipitated uremia, and the patient would have gone into develop a metabolic acidosis, or a diabetic ketoacidosis can be precipitated by that. Pneumothorax can be occurring incidentally in a febrile patient. That may be the reason. Rarely, it may be due to collapse because pulmonary embolism is known to produce collapse because of the obstruction to the pulmonary arteries can deplete the surfactant, and that segment may undergo collapse, and the patient may develop breathlessness due to that. So look for localized crepitations and bronchial breathing, suspect pneumonia, pleural effusion with the intercostal tenderness, suspect empyema, pleural rub may be due to pulmonary infarction or tuberculosis or polyserositis, like you get in SLD and other collagen vascular disorders. Basal capitations may be due to a cardiogenic pulmonary edema or cardiac pulmonary edema or a non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, ARDS. Bronchi, it may be due to bronchial asthma, COPD, or early pulmonary edema. Even pulmonary embolism can present with bronchi as a predominant manifestation. Soft hepatomegaly, always suspect fatty liver first these days. If it is a firm hepatomegaly, it could be granulomatous hepatitis in a febrile patient. But more often these days, coexisting chronic liver disease is a cause for firm hepatomegaly in a febrile patient. It may not have anything to do with the fever directly. Intercostal tenderness over the liver could suggest liver abscess in a febrile patient. If you have renal angle tenderness, one should specifically look for it, otherwise miss it. It can suggest pyelonephritis or perinephric abscess, and suprapubic tenderness may be there. Splenomegaly is soft if in enteric fever, but if it is a firm splenomegaly, start suspecting malaria or underlying portal hypertension due to liver disease or subacute infected endocarditis. With tenderness over the spleen, suspect splenic abscess or tuberculosis spleen, or the splenomegaly, firm splenomegaly may be due to an incidental leukemia or lymphoma, which may be the cause of fever itself, or it may be an underlying hemolytic condition like autoimmune hemolysis, where you may get fever and autoimmune hemolysis and firm splenomegaly. In cardiovascular examination, muffled heart sounds might indicate myocarditis. Murmurs could suggest infective endocarditis, but it could also be ischemic heart disease. Anyway, in a febrile patient, if there is a valvular lesion, always rule out infective endocarditis. There are pointers to it. Very high ESR, microscopic hematuria can help you. Pericardial rub in a febrile patient could indicate tuberculosis. We had recently a patient. That patient had staphylococcal sepsis, enteric fever. To begin with, it was enteric fever. Then the patient gone on to develop staph sepsis, and later on he developed pericarditis, and that pericarditis was actually with the fusion was tuberculosis. So all the three were present in the same patient with fever, or polyserositis due to collagen vascular disorders, or it may be pyogenic or rheumatic pericarditis sometimes. Then if the patient has altered sensorium or coma, suspect metabolic causes as mentioned before, but look for meningitis, encephalitis by signs, meningeal signs. Do not forget malaria, enteric encephalopathy, typhus, and coexisting CVA as I mentioned before. And always look for neck stiffness if there is headache. And in a patient with PEO, always look at the spine as well. This was a patient with a mild gibbous deformity and paraspinal abscess. There was tenderness over here. Sometimes you may miss it unless you look for it. So the important point is to diagnose any fever is epidemiological background, history of eating outside, travel, unhygienic food or water. That might suggest typhoid or other fecal oral transfer diseases. Working in wetland construction area, you may get it may be suggest supporting diagnose a lepto or typhus. Working in bushy areas or forest land or contact with animal, it can be typhus or enteric fever. Exposure to you need to when before you consider malaria, we need to consider chances of getting exposed to mosquito bite. There's no point thinking of malaria in a person who is always working in an air-conditioned office, traveling by air-conditioned car, and directly coming to airport and then coming home. You need not consider malaria as a possibility. So important pointers to diagnosis are these clustering of cases, history of mosquito bites, conjunctival congestion, diffuse erythema you may get in dengue fever. This is what you find in dengue fever. Diffuse erythema, subconjunctival congestion, photophobia, retroorbital pain. These are very typical of dengue fever. On the skin, you get a blanching erythema also. So therefore, finally, the steps to diagnose is clinical features and epidemiological setting, the most important. Simple laboratory tests to increase accuracy of clinical diagnosis. Actually, you would have arrived at a diagnosis, or you have one or two differential diagnoses. And to differentiate between that, you need simple laboratory tests. And these tests are just a total count, differential count, ESR, liver enzymes, and urine routine. These are enough in 99% of the cases. The so-called specific tests are rarely only useful in clinical practice. In fact, it's not useful at all in most patients. Very rarely only they are useful. Like the serology that you do, by the time the patient would have recovered, because dengue and lepto will recover spontaneously. This was a patient, a 49-year-old boy. He had fever of 3 weeks. ESR was very high. Leukocytosis was there. So we had all features of sepsis. All investigations initially were normal, including chest X-ray. But while under observation, he developed tachypnea. Then the chest X-ray showed suspicious bronchopneumonia, which we suspected as staphylococcal pneumonia because it was bilateral. And incidentally, blood culture grew staph aureus, and the echo showed the large tricuspid vegetations. It was a normal valve endocarditis, and the predisposing cause was purely malnutrition. We learn about normal valve endocarditis in the Western setting as immunosuppression, but in our setting, the commonest cause of immunosuppression is malnutrition. This was a patient who came with fever, and he had a mild AS and AR. So naturally, the diagnosis of infected endocarditis was made, and people started on treatment, and the patient actually improved. By the time the echocardiography came as no evidence of vegetations. Immediately, the patient was discharged without any other antibiotic, continuation of antibiotic. But after a month, he comes back with high-grade fever and left-sided hemiplegia and embolic occlusion of the fingers and toes. So echo may not reveal the vegetations always. They are normal. Small vegetations are not usually picked up in the echocardiography. So one should stick to the clinical diagnosis in febrile patients rather than depending too much on investigations. Total count and differential count are very useful. Neutrophilia, if it is there, we can confidently say it is not a viral illness or enteric fever unless by chance the patient has received steroid. If you find leukocytosis without receiving steroid, that could favor leptospirosis or typhus. Leukopenia favors dengue, typhus, and typhoid fever. High ESR, you will not get very high ESR in typhoid fever. So very high ESR favors urine tract infection, lepto, or typhus. Urine sediments again favors urine tract infection, lepto, or typhus. Very high or very low total count can support bone marrow infiltration or bone marrow aplasia. Leukopenia we get in typhoid, but do not get it always. In fact, absence of polymorphonuclear leukocytosis is more common in typhoid. But if you get leukopenia, that is consistent. But you will also get it in viral fever, drug reactions, brucellosis. But do not forget coexisting fetal folic acid deficiency as the cause for leukopenia. That may fool you. That may be the reason for that. Or it may be an infiltrated disease of the bone marrow. Thrombocytopenia in a febrile patient these days always suspect dengue and other viral infections, including COVID-19. Leptospirosis and enteric fever can produce that. Drug-induced thrombocytopenia may be a reason for that. But again, always suspect fetal folic acid deficiency or coexisting ITP because these problems are increasing nowadays. Urine microscopy helps if you have suspected an infection like UTI or leptospirosis and infected endocarditis. Infected endocarditis, you might get a microscopic hematuria. Eosinophilia suggests underlying hypersensitivity drug reactions, Hodgkin's, or adrenal insufficiency, especially if there are clinical features of it. Peripheral, if the fever is severe and is prolonged, look for malaria. And if there are indicators in the hemogram, look for other disorders like leukemias. SGOT-PT helps if you have a clinical diagnosis. If not, it will not, because very often it may be due to coexisting non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or alcohol-induced. Elevated alkaline phosphatase in a prolonged fever might suggest granulomatous hepatitis, but it could also be due to vitamin D deficiency. First possibility should be that. Albumin globin reversal could be due to a chronic inflammatory process like vasculitic disorders, tuberculosis including, or granulomatous hepatitis, but it could also mean underlying chronic liver disease. Electrolyte imbalance we need to look for if the patient has altered sensorium or seizure. Glucose in all sick patients, especially since diabetes is so common. Hypoglycemia we need to detect, hyperglycemia we need to detect. Blood urea in suspected uremia, and all severe and prolonged fevers, it has to be looked at once at least. Chest X-ray helps if you are suspected pulmonary tuberculosis or miliary tuberculosis, or one can also look for hilar or mediastinal lymph node enlargement and incidentally occurring pleural effusion, pneumonia, or liver abscess because the right dormal diaphragm may be elevated in that case. And repeat study when you repeat chest X-ray may be indicator when you are suspected miliary tuberculosis. Manto test is extremely useful when your clinical diagnosis is good, especially in extrapulmonary tuberculosis. A strongly positive Manto test supports the diagnosis of tuberculosis. Bone marrow is done as a last resort when you do not have a clue to look for malaria parasite or salmonella, or evidence of tuberculosis or infiltration by leukemia or lymphoma as the cause of fever. Echocardiography, use it carefully in selected cases. Ultrasound especially, there is no use except when you are looking for pus somewhere. There is no point asking for ultrasound as an investigation for PEO if you do not suspect something there. But sometimes it may be to look for a lymph node enlargement to support a diagnosis of a condition with lymphadenopathy and fever. Lymph node excision biopsy only when a lymphoma is clinically suspected, not for other disorders like leukemias. Body fluids can be subjected to examination depending on the clinical setting. So when to do specific lab tests for infections? They are useful only to pin the organism in an ongoing epidemic, like the RT-PCR, H1N1, dengue S1, chikungunya, leptoserology. They help us when large number of cases come. You may do it in a few index cases to settle the issue, to know what is going on, rather than doing it in every patient. This test will not help any given individual because it is positive does not mean you are giving a specific management to anyone. Do it only in a few sample cases for epidemiological purposes. Positive test does not mean that a given individual has that infection. Even asymptomatic individuals, if you start looking for, you may find any of these organisms. When will you call it as a PUO? In most cases of fever, the patient recovers spontaneously, or the initial evaluation leads to a diagnosis. But if the fever lasts for 2-3 weeks, repeat physical examinations and laboratory tests are unrevealing, then only consider the label as PUO. When will you decide to treat a febrile patient? Avoid routine use of antipyretics in undiagnosed fevers. Because with a diagnosis, you can use antipyretics. If you do not have a diagnosis, using antipyretics will mask the clinical indicators of a patient's response and the course of the illness. Temperature charts are useful to give diagnostic clues, but that should be without using paracetamol. After giving paracetamol, temperature charts will not help us. So we need to find out whether the fever is intermittent, remittent, continuous, or step-guard. After getting a clue to this pattern only, and already getting a clue to the diagnosis only after getting a clue to the diagnosis only, we start using paracetamol, not otherwise. And use only paracetamol. Do not use NSAID to control fever. This is a really important issue. Many patients with leptospirosis or dengue fever go into complications because of over-the-counter NSAID use. If at all, ibuprofen may be used as a last resort, even that is known to have problems. Some patients develop Reye syndrome or acute fatty liver, especially in children. Renal damage is notoriously common. They may present with acute interstitial nephritis. So the take-home messages are no fever workup as in USA. They have a attitude of any fever isn't a battery of investigations. They forget about the patient. They do not see the patient. The telemedicine and teleconsultations are meant for such people only. But I am sure they will be missing the diagnosis. Meticulous clinical evaluation is the only solution. We need to individualize the workup with very few lab investigations. A period of observation always helps. And a planned empirical therapy helps. Work for social reforms to prevent these infections occurring repeatedly. Educate the people because chikungunya, H1N1, COVID-19 are not really serious. If you look at dengue fever and other issues like leptospirosis, typhoid, and typhus, doctors are teachers as well regarding reasons behind the fevers. And that is why I always insist on large number of family doctors who will also be working as friend, philosopher, and guide, educating the people on health and wellness, including so that, and not only that, they will be able to diagnose early, prevent unnecessary hospitalization, and we need to teach them about social determinants of health also. People are unaware of social determinants of health. They think that diseases are of natural occurrence, and every disease can be cured by doctors. That kind of attitude is prevailing, which need to change. Remember that all infections are due to agent, host, and environment interaction. We are after the host in COVID-19, in agent only. Agent, if the dose is very high, you may get an infection, especially when the defense mechanisms are poor. But most of 99% of the time, you get a very minimal dose of exposure only, and the handling of the organism or the agent will be effective by the host if the host has a good diet and lifestyle. This is what we have control on. This is what we should focus on. We should also focus on the environment to prevent the entry of the agent into the body. We need to focus on the environment and host rather than running after the agent, catching it. It's like chasing a wind. Like we are failing in it. Remember that infections, it is a comorbidities that decide the outcome. It's not the organism that decides the outcome. If you are NASH, if you are alcoholic liver disease or other liver disease, if you are COPD, hypertension, diabetes, if you are obese, and if you have vitamin deficiencies, you are likely to get into problems. So why blame the organism alone for all the diseases? So the reforms needed are, we need to have people-centered health policy. Healthcare is not just disease care alone. We need a three-tier referral system. We need economic and social reforms to provide all the social determinants of health to every every individual. Let us not forget our priorities. Now we are hearing that Zika virus is coming. What will you do? Are we going to lock down people forever? So let us go after these basic issues. Malnutrition is there in 99 to 100% of the people. Even this individual is malnourished. We are not talking about malnutrition of this grade of severity. All of us have malnutrition because nobody knows what a balanced diet is. In one survey, as I mentioned before, we found that 98.5% even did not know what a balanced diet is, leave alone consuming it. Even if they know, they may not be getting it. And this is the next problem. We do not have safe drinking water through public distribution system, and we are marketing Divya Gel and damaging our environment. We use technology without science and common sense now. Preventing and reducing waste generation alone is scientific approach. Poor waste handling and poor management of waste is all everywhere present. And we need to promote proper waste disposal habits in individuals, because that is what is needed to tackle dengue, Zika virus, and typhus and malaria. And we need to provide good waste management culture in the society, decentralized waste management, like Sweden has done already. And we need to provide sanitation to everyone. When you say wash your hands, you need to provide a wash basin at least. And we should provide shelter for everyone. This is all due to improper distribution of resources. This is not their problem. If there are people staying in these kind of slums, it's our problem as well, because you cannot achieve health in compartments. And in this scenario, unchecked promotion of consumerism by our celebrities, cricket stars and film stars, endorsing unwanted things. This again an unscientific approach. This unchecked consumerism nurtures all these unwanted tendencies, and people end up having uh, diseases of the spine and obesity and all sorts of diseases. So we need to work for a stable health pyramid. At the base of it, everyone should have access to all the social determinants of health, like balanced diet, safe drinking water, shelter, primary education, sanitation facilities, and good waste management, clean environment, good lifestyle habits, enough places for exercise. And then we need large number of primary care doctors, family doctors. We need to have trained family doctors sitting in PHCs and CHCs. And then we reduce the number of patients reaching these general hospitals, manned by internal medicine people, pediatrics, OBG, general surgery, orthopedics, ENT, ophthalmology, dental, and all. This is another necessity. We are forgetting all these three, and we are focusing on super specialty and cancer hospitals. The meager 1% GDP which we have spent on healthcare is invested in these two. We are neglecting all these. So how can India progress if we are going like this? So all doctors should be aware of these basic issues when we talk about infections, including COVID-19. Thank you for the patient listening, and I'll take questions if you have any. Or
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such a wonderful academic feast for us. Thank you so much. I hope so many queries from the part of the participants. If you have any queries, you can ask directly to sir now, or you can leave it in the chat box also. If there is no direct question, we can go to the chat box.
please.
How cerebral vein thrombosis is related to seizures?
Because cerebral vein thrombosis is a cortical phenomenon. Anything which irritates the cortex can produce seizures. All the cerebral vein thrombosis are mostly located in the cortex, and that directly acts as an irritating lesion, and that is the reason for seizures in cerebral vein thrombosis. As compared to that, if intracerebral hemorrhage does not have seizures because it is in the deep cerebral regions.
Next question. How will typhus present with the rigor and chills? Will typhus present?
Rigor and chills are most often seen when an organism localizes in one organ. Typhoid fever does not have chills and rigor because most often it is not localized to one organ. But rarely, typhus or typhoid can have organ localization. Say, for example, typhoid fever with the urinary tract infection can come with chills and rigor. Chills and rigor are uncommon in these conditions, but rarely it can occur. But I just wanted to include it because the atypical manifestations of common diseases we still have to consider as a possibility. It's not common to get in typhus or typhoid fever.
So next question, how to manage fevers in post-COVID patients?
How to manage
for fever after a couple of days to weeks of COVID recovery.
How to manage fever in a patient who comes after 2 weeks of COVID recovery? I didn't get the question properly.
How to manage fevers in post-COVID patient who consult for fever after a couple of days to weeks of COVID recovery?
It's just like any other patient. I don't find any difference, but the patient who had symptomatic COVID are the patients with comorbidities or vitamin deficiencies or subclinical illnesses. We need to find out what all problems they have because majority are asymptomatic. That means they are healthier. So if they had COVID, symptomatic COVID, they have underlying comorbidities which are not diagnosed. So look for them. They may be having non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. They may be overweight. They may not be consuming a proper diet, or they may be having smoking, alcohol, or so many other problems underlying, including beta folic acid deficiency. Find out all of them, correct all of them. That is the first and foremost. Then look for the possible other infections. Sometimes they may have autoimmune disorders coexisting. Because these days autoimmune disorders are very common. So after a COVID infection, they may come with a hyperinflammatory state, multiple organ involvement. Again, we are attributing everything to COVID. Actually, it was COVID which triggered more inflammation in a person who has been walking around with autoimmune disorders. It's not directly due to COVID again. These are the mistakes that are committed because of this organ-based clinical approach. You need to have a patient-centered approach where you are not biased towards any particular problem. That kind of approach is missing now. That's specifically because we don't have enough family doctors and internal medicine doctors. Internal medicine doctors are all going after specialization. And that is why we are missing a generalist approach these days.
So one more question. What is the mechanism in dehydration fever?
Dehydration does not produce fever. Dehydration can produce the mechanism of dehydration in a patient with fever. Okay, I get. In a patient with the fever, because of the vasodilatation, there will be increased fluid loss from the skin. And the patient, because of the anorexia, nausea, even vomiting because of gastritis, which is very common, fluid intake may be less also. So on one side, you have increased water loss, and to maintain the temperature at normal level by the normal mechanisms, the body has to lose water from the skin because of vasodilatation as well. There is more loss from the skin. There is an increased demand also, but the patient does not take adequately, and that can lead to dehydration. And once you have dehydration, it can complicate the illness. That is why very good adequate fluid intake itself is enough to save several patients with febrile illness of which are self-recovering, which are otherwise capable of recovering by themselves.
Okay. So next question, How to decide upon sending NS1 antigen versus IgM in suspected dengue fever patient?
I would say that in dengue fever, you don't have to do any of them because it is a self-subsiding febrile illness. Neither NS1 nor IgM antibody. You don't need any of them because I had seen these being done in patients who come purely for thrombocytopenia. So it is a injudicious approach because dengue fever can be clinically diagnosed. If the patient comes with high-grade fever, chills, fever with myalgia, and your first diagnosis is dengue fever, or your second diagnosis leptospirosis, a hemogram and liver enzymes and urine routine is an ESR also is enough to differentiate. If you have 2 or 3 possibilities on that day, possibly you may send an NS1 antigen also, and other investigations like malaria parasite and lepto. Even leptoserology will not be positive. Actually, you can manage leptospirosis and dengue fever without sending any investigations once you are familiar with the clinical picture. And those who are not familiar with the clinical picture will not be able to diagnose it with NS1 or serology. So it is of epidemiological purpose only. There's no point using it, doing it regularly in anyone. You can diagnose it clinically. That kind of clinical competence one has to develop.
So next question, is fever a defense mechanism in a patient with infection?
Fever is not proven as a defense mechanism in some naturopaths are going around telling that fever is a defense mechanism, but it's not probably true. But fever, allowing the fever to continue does not hasten recovery. Control of fever gives relief to the patient also, but do not be overzealous in controlling fever. That is all. But you can allow the fever to continue. Maybe the patient can recover naturally. There is no proof that using antipyretics will also hasten recovery. So you don't have to. You can take the path by depending on the patient choice and your plan. If the patient is comfortable to go with the fever, you can just give adequate fluid intake, absolute bed rest, and tepid sponging. That's more than enough. But if the patient is so uncomfortable, give paracetamol. And if paracetamol is contraindicated, better not to give anything. And if the patient is adamant that fever has to be controlled, then only go for ibuprofen. Do not use mefenamic acid. Majority of the patients are getting mefenamic acid and paracetamol combination. So anyway, fever I don't think is going to control the infection. Maybe they have a point of argument. So you don't have to neglect it also. That is one attitude we need to have. Some of these people, when they raise some points, we should not be totally neglecting that. We should explore that possibility. Like for example, several homeopathy doctors have been going around telling that leptospirosis, the patients who get problems are the patients who receive paracetamol. Then I started exploring and found out that it is not paracetamol they got NSAID. So that is how we need to go after it. Rather than laughing at them, we need to find out whether there is any truth in what they say. That's how you have to approach rather than talking against them.
Okay, so next question, so diet during fever.
Diet during fever is as balanced vegetarian diet is ideal for a patient during fever. It should be light diet also. It should be high fiber. Large amount of vegetables, fruits should be there. Enough water should be there, and a protein which is easily digestible. Easily digestible proteins are first to come is pulses. Next is the curd. Never take milk. Milk will upset the stomach. Third will be fish. Last only meat. In that order you can take. If the patient tolerates, you can give any of them, but do not go for fried fish and meat. Egg also can be given. There is no choice actually. You can go by the choice of the patient, but tell them to take simple rice. Our kanji and pyre is a very good choice in febrile illness. But or thyroid curd also can be given, but always make sure that they get fruits and vegetables in addition.
So regarding fever during the post-operative day 1, when can we say it is due to infection rather than post-operative inflammatory process?
Post-operative inflammatory process is not universal. So if they have fever, always look for infection. Signs of infection, sepsis, you can always look for. So one should be on the lookout, get a hemogram, polymorphonuclear leukocytosis, examine the urine. And if at all, if needed, you may get other features of inflammation. Infection, you have to be on the lookout. Lung infection, urinary infections are the commonest. And septicemia can occur. Sometimes even transfusion malaria can occur. So one should be searching for infections. And if you do not have any infection only, brand it as post-operative fever. Thrombophlebitis, it is obvious, you can probably attribute it to. Otherwise, you should attribute it as an infection first.
So that's all in the chat box.
Okay. Any direct questions? Otherwise, we make any direct questions?
Sir, illannu thonu.
Okay, then I will
Okay.
wind up
So
the
we
session.
can wind up the session. So I invite Dr. Subin, Junior Resident of Department of Family Medicine, for a vote of thanks.
Good evening, all. Respected sir, speaker Dr. P.K. Shashiran sir, and all dear participants. I consider it a great honor to propose vote of thanks to all of you for making this webinar series a great success. First, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. P.K. Shashiran sir, for making this excellent presentation and making this webinar series interesting, and also stressing on the importance of clinical evaluation rather than depending on investigations, and also regarding the importance of family doctors, and also teaching us the importance of clinical evaluation. And I would like to thank all the participants for finding time the schedule for joining our webinar series and making this a successful series. So once again, I thank you all for participating, and I thank our speaker, Dr. P.K. Shashiran sir, for this wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you.
Thank you,
See
sir.
you. See. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.